Hello again. This is Pastor Bob Douglas, and I'm speaking to you from my home office. I've been doing a study on the Gospel of John, and this morning I'd just like to take a minute to share with you that the writer of the Gospel of John is one of the first scientists to discuss Jesus. Now, you might say to me, Pastor Bob, that is a big stretch. Yeah, probably is. A big stretch. A scientist. Well, we didn't have scientists back in 2,000 years ago, did we? Well, not specifically. You didn't go into a laboratory and put a bunch of stuff in a test tube and evaluate it. But what's the scientific method? The scientific method is that if you have a theory, if you have a workable set of ideas, you should be able to test it in several different ways, procedures, to discover or determine whether or not your theory holds water, whether it's provable, whether it's predictable, whether it's repeatable. Just because you may have a theory about lightning striking in your backyard because you had a tree in your backyard that was struck by lightning and destroyed, try and repeat that. Your scientific method. I mean, how do you repeat that? If your theory is lightning tends to strike my backyard, how do you repeat it? How do you look at it from different ways to see whether or not your scientific method is valid, your theory is valid? Okay, so first of all, you have to know how the machine works. Okay. This is a strange story, but I'll just tell it to you anyway. Back in 1969, I was in the Navy, and I had been in the Navy only about 11 months. I was 21 years old. I was very much just a kid. I had only finished my machinist mate training, 4 months ago, 5 months ago? I was on board the aircraft carrier Lexington, and that's a very, very big and very complicated machine, and they had assigned me to take care of the number 4 generator. I was a third-class petty officer, a machinist mate, and so because of my ranking and because of my pay grade and my rating as a machinist mate, they put me in charge of the number 4 generator, and number 4 had a problem somewhere along that line. I had a group of about 4 or 5 men that worked with me, and so the generator that keeps the electric lights on board the aircraft carrier is a very important piece of equipment. There were only 4 of them on board the ship, and each one had to be able to carry the load to provide enough electricity for the entire ship. And that's with airplanes taking off and, landing and radar beams working and computers and all the other kinds of things they had working there, communications and everything, all depended on having electricity, dependable, steady, constant electricity. And so it was a very responsible job, and they handed it to this 21-year-old raw recruit, still with very clear memories of boot camp earlier that year. And they said, go down there and fix the number 4 generator. Okay, so if you get the picture of this, you have to have this picture of a machine that's so big it takes up 2 floors, two stories, and about as much space with all the electrical stuff and the boards and everything as a small 2-bedroom, 2-story house. It's huge, and it's massive in its size. Just the condenser is an inch thick solid brass and holds as much as a swimming pool. It's a gigantic machine, okay? And powerful. Oh my goodness, is it powerful. It's designed so that hot, superheated steam comes into the main throttle area and is shot into a whole series of fan blades, turbines they call them, and the fan blades turn the steam to go this way the first time through, and then it turns and comes back this way, and then it turns and goes this way and back and forth all the way through the turbine. There's a whole series of these fan blades all attached to the main shaft. Each one is bigger and more higher diameter than the next one, and they just keep getting all the way through the machine until finally you've taken all the heat and all the pressure of that steam and you've turned it into nothing but just simply fresh water again. So you take water, you boil it into steam, you superheat the steam so that it's much hotter than it would be in a natural state. You put it under extremely high pressures, you shoot it into the turbine, it starts to spin the turbines, and as it passes through the turbine, it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger in volume until it's finally dumped down and it becomes just like a tropical rainforest down in the condenser, back to water again. Okay, so you have to know how the machine works. How do you know how it works? Well, we studied it in machinist mate school. It's 600 pounds of pressure, and the steam is heated to 489 degrees. Now, normal water boils about 212 degrees, okay? 212 at sea level, which is where the ships are. So you put it through the boiler twice, once to make it into steam, and the second time to turn it into superheated steam, 489 degrees. You push it into a main steam line that carries 600 pounds of pressure of steam. They pass it through the ship over to where the generator is, and the machinist mates turn the throttle and open up the steam valves, and the turbine begins to turn as the steam. But that's not quite all. It goes from 600 pounds of steam all the way through into a nearly perfect 30-inch vacuum. It's 29.5 or something like that. It's not quite a perfect vacuum. But this gigantic condenser where the steam eventually falls down into to become water again is at a nearly perfect vacuum. That's how the machine works. It has to go from 600 pounds to a total vacuum at the other end. If anything in that process fails to work correctly, if you don't have enough steam pressure, if it's too cool and it's not 489 degrees, if there was something wrong with this machine. It was not producing electricity with the power it should have. And so all the gauges and everything were showing us where the problem was. There was air sneaking into our perfect vacuum and ruining that 29.5-inch vacuum. And that cut down the efficiency of the steam working to turn the turbine, and everything was falling apart. Everything was not according to the way it was designed. You see, you have to know how the machine is supposed to operate, how it It's designed to operate, how it functions, in order to know what has gone wrong or what might be happening inside. And so they said, okay, Bob. Well, they didn't call me Bob back in those days. They had a lot of interesting other names for me. But anyway, they said, go down there and take your crew and work as long as it takes to make sure that that number 4 generator is back up to 100% perfect performance. Okay, so we went down there. There's air getting into our system. So we checked all the normal places. There are a lot of seals, there are a lot of covers and things, and you check to make sure that there's no place for air to get in. We did all the normal stuff. Everything seemed to be working fine. The engineer was down there, our main chief engineer, all kinds of things. They couldn't figure out where the air was coming into the machine. Okay, so we decided. I had something to say about it. I mean, I wasn't the boss of the whole thing, but I was certainly the lead man. Okay. I said, look, if we can't see where the air is sneaking in, but we could see water squirting out through the same hole. Okay, make it. You see how we can't see the air because it's invisible, but if we fill the machine with water and then put it under pressure, it would squirt out, right? Same place. Vacuum, pressure. But we can see the water. Okay, so we started filling the big condenser with water. Now, on a warship, fresh water is a precious commodity. It has to be made by a bunch of evaporators, and it's stored in tanks completely separate from the seawater, and it's in a limited supply. Okay, so they started pumping the fresh water into the machine. We put it under pressure, checked everything, all the fittings, all the connections, all the different various things, went through the whole machine. No leaks. We actually had put some green dye in the water so that you could see if green water was sneaking out. No green water. Well, now it's half full. It's halfway up the condenser. We have about a half of a swimming pool full of water. Still no. The engineer starts to tell me, Mr. Douglas, your idea doesn't seem to be working like we thought it would. There's no water leaking out. Yeah, that's true. We're out of fresh water. We don't have any more nice, cool, fresh water. We have to, if you want some more water, we're going to have to give you really, really hot water that's been used in the boilers, and it's really hot. Well, let's send us the hot water. And we kept filling the machine higher and higher and higher. It gets so high that the bottom edges of the turbines are hanging down in the water. The engineer's worried about that. It's nearly full. It's nearly completely full of water. And there's still no leak. But you gotta find... I know how the machine's supposed to work. And if it comes to the point where I was wrong, I'll say I apologize, and we'll start over. In just a few minutes, it finally got right up to the top. It was just completely full, and 1/2 of an inch from being completely full, green water started to leak out of a seal at the very top of the machine. Good news! We found the leak. That was a long story beyond that. There was only one guy who could sneak down in there into the bowels of that machine, who could fit down in the space that was left around it and get down in there and repair the thing that had to be fixed. And that was me. I was down in there stuck for about 3 hours trying to wait around to get the parts I needed and the things ready to get it fixed. But when I climbed back out 3 hours later, the machine was humming like a clock. Okay, so if you don't know how the machine works, you have no theory as to what is a problem, you can't figure out what it's supposed to do, okay, or how it can go wrong. Let me explain. Now, that was a silly story about my Navy days, okay. I'm now much too large and rotund to have gotten myself down into that spot to repair it anyway. But it was kind of fun remembering you have to know how the machine works. And I knew there were some simple rules that you can follow to teach you and teach the rest of the crew what needed to be done. All right, now having done all that, let me talk about the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John is, I said, the very first book that puts the event of Jesus Christ coming into the world to minister to us into a scientific study. Now, what's the working theory we're looking for? Does God have total control of his creation? Does God own the planet and the physical, chemical, biological systems that he created? Does he own it? Does he control it? Does he work within it? Does he have final authority over everything, including us? You know, these biological forms, these biological entities, as well as our emotional and spiritual entities. And you think about that, and you say, okay, let's just look at what John gives us as his scientific method. And he does this with 7 individual proofs. Now, I'm going to read just a few verses. I'm going to lead you to where these 7 proofs are, and then I'm going to leave you to read all of the details of what the story is and how it worked. But the first of the 7 proofs happens in the 2nd chapter of the Gospel of John. Jesus had just called his disciples in the area of the Jordan where John the Baptist had been baptizing. When they had gathered as a group, including this young man from Jerusalem who's tagging along with Jesus just to see what's going to happen, and John the Baptist says this is the guy that's going to be the main guy, the Messiah, the one we've been waiting for. So this guy named John goes along, kind of watching, kind of learning, trying to observe, and he's the one who's going to give us the testimony. So he's watching carefully because he wants to know for sure himself. And this is how he learned, okay? And this is John 2, verse 1. On the 3rd day, after getting to Capernaum, in that area around Galilee, a wedding took place in Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. A wedding. It's a very, very big deal. Everybody in the community is invited. This is a community-changing event. When one family marries another part of the family, it's huge. And so a wedding in Cana is a very, very large social celebration. It's gigantic. Okay, and so not only Jesus, who was not really a neighbor, not really, He never called Cana his home, but he was there as a visitor, and the disciples were there, and Mary, his mother, was there, and they were all invited. Verse 3, here's the problem. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied, "My hour is not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." And what actually happened then following that was Jesus instructed the servants to fill 6 stone jars. They had been carved out of a soft stone like a limestone, and they had been sealed so that they could hold water and not just leak out. And so the stone vessels were there. Each one carried, in general terms, about 30 gallons of water. They were used for ceremonial cleansing. They usually set close to the door, the entrance, where someone would come in off the street, and there would be servants there who would dip water out of these stone vessels, and they would use that water to splash on your feet. You kick off your shoes, and they would rinse the debris from the street off of your feet. And so with all of the guests coming in, all the people coming in, and all this huge guest list, it took 6 of these vessels, 30 gallons each, to take care of all those guests coming off the street. Okay, so now they're empty. They're sitting there, 30 gallons each. So he tells the servants, fill them all the way up to the brim with water. So they went to the source of the water, probably a well close by, and they got the water, brought it back, filled these stone vessels, completely filled up to the brim. I don't know whether you're of an age that you actually mixed Kool-Aid crystals into water to make a kind of an interesting drink called Kool-Aid. Well, we used to do that. And you didn't fill the jug all the way to the top because you had to put the Kool-Aid crystals in, then you always had to put a bunch of sugar in, if you mix it like I do, and you had to stir it up to get the drink that we would call Kool-Aid fixed. Well, if your vessel is already filled with water up to the brim, you can't add anything to it that might change the taste of it, to change the nature of what's in there, and so that it's filled right to the brim. That's what the testimony was. They filled all these vessels completely filled, 30 gallons each. And then Jesus said, take a dipper of that water and take it to the master of ceremonies, the man who's in charge to make sure that everything is being done in the wedding according to what the normal traditions and everything were, the expectations. So they took the dipper of water to the master of ceremony. He took a sip of it, and then he made an exclamation. He said, "This is really, really good wine." Most people give the best wine first, and they save the junk wine for later. Who knows why? I've never been to a wedding where they had wine, so I don't know. I have my suspicions, but I don't know. So, anyway, this is really, really good wine. But servants knew that they hadn't dipped it out of a wine container. They dipped it out of the water container. Jesus had turned water into wine. Good wine. The scientific theory is, the working theory is that God is in control of his creation. God knows how the machine is supposed to work. He designed it. He created it. He knows what the working rules are. He knows what the limitations of the machine as it's designed, but he's still in the creating business. Well, if you wanted to turn water into wine, the only way you can do it in a natural setting, in a normal everyday setting, is to take the water and pour it on the roots of a vineyard, the grapevines in a vineyard, and do that for a whole growing season. Then you take the grapes and then you crush them and you get the juice out of them and you put them in a container and you let the natural process of taking grape juice and the sugars that are involved in that juice and turning them into a wine that can be served at a wedding. But it takes time. It takes a growing year. It takes a lot of time to put them in the vessels, wait for the fermentation process to start and finish, and then there's some things going on with aging. The longer the wine sets, the richer it gets in its taste and its body. I'm told. Really? I'm told. I don't know. If Jesus is able to take a natural element, a natural compound like water, and turn it through the very complex hydrocarbon that is the compound we call wine, that's not normal science. I took inorganic and organic chemistry. I know what wine's supposed to do, and I don't know of any process known to our scientific community that allows that to happen. It just doesn't happen. So my first assumption is, well, that looks to me like a supporting scientific experiment in support of our theory that God is in control and God is a continuing creator and a sustainer of his creation. And it sort of looks like that proves, at least through that single experiment, that our theory is correct. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to the second one, all right, because this is kind of interesting. It's a lot of fun. Get to see, all right. Looking at the second miraculous sign in the Gospel of John, it happens in John the 4th chapter, and it starts in verse 43. Okay, this is, again, the writer of John calls himself the beloved disciple and says he's watching these things happen and he's giving testimony of what he sees and what he hears and what happens, the actual events. And so here's the story as it happens in John 4, verse 43. After the 2 days, he left for Galilee. He had been in Jerusalem. Now he's coming back to Galilee. Verse 44. Now Jesus himself had pointed out that a prophet has no honor in his own country. Verse 45. When he arrived in Galilee, the Galileans welcomed him. They had seen all that he had done in Jerusalem and the Passover festival, for they had also been there. We're not told much about that, but that's what happened. 46. Once more he visited Cana in Galilee, where he had turned the water into wine. And there was a certain royal official whose son lay sick in Capernaum. When this man heard that Jesus had arrived in Galilee from Judea, he went to him and begged him to heal his son, who was very close to death. Verse 48, unless you people see signs and wonders, Jesus told him, you will never believe. The royal official said, Sir, come down before my child dies. The request was, come down to my house, some distance away, please, before my son is no longer able to stay alive. Verse 50, go, Jesus replied, your son will live. The man took Jesus at his word and departed, and while he was still on the way, his servants met him with the news that his son, his boy, was living. When he inquired as to the time when his son got better, they said to him, "Yesterday at 1 in the afternoon the fever left him." And then the father realized that this was the exact time at which Jesus had said to him, "Your son will live." And so he and his whole household believed. This was, according to the Gospel of John now, the second sign Jesus performed after coming from Judea to Galilee. Now, everybody loves a good healing miracle. A good healing miracle is part of the engine that drives the gospel story. Jesus is taking the people that have diseases of one kind or another and healing them, and it's a wonderful, wonderful, because we're all prone to getting sick. We're in the COVID-19 experience. Everybody looks at things and goes, "Ooh, that could be me. I don't know. On the ventilator for 2 weeks." This was a boy who was very, very sick. But he was a couple days travel from where Jesus was. That was a problem, right? Everybody knows that when you lay your hands on a sick person, or they're right there in front of you, Jesus has a tremendous story to tell of being able to heal people by putting his hands on them, or by loving them, or by being right there in front of him. This is not that story. So it's not really a healing story. I'm sorry if you think this is a healing story. That's wonderful. I'm not going to deny you. But this is a story with something deeper going on. Think about it for a second. Our working theory is that God is still in control of everything, still in charge of everything that he has created. That's our working theory. Scientifically thinking, we just changed water into wine. That was one proof. Okay. This is different than water to wine. This is a young man that's terribly, terribly, gravely ill, but a great distance away from Jesus. Yesterday at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, which means the man had been traveling at least half of a day and half of a day again, when his servants met him in the middle. How did Jesus heal him from such a great distance? When I say this, I want you to understand the depth of what actually happened here. Not only does Jesus have the power in his hands, the power to change water into wine, which is physically impossible for us, he also has the power and the authority of all the hosts of heaven, all of the armies of God. When Jesus did a very similar miracle for a Roman centurion, the Roman centurion said, "I'm a man under authority, and I am a man in authority. So when I am told I have to do something, I do it. And when I tell my soldiers, you have to do this, go here, do this, they do it. They return back to me and report, okay, it's been done. All right. So he said, I see in you, Jesus, I see you as a man who also has real authority. Real authority. And if you say it will be done, it will be done. Jesus said, I've never seen such faith in all of Israel. No one's ever perceived that as being true before. But in this case, it's another indication. And by the way, he said that the servant would get well, and it was done exactly as he wanted it done at the moment at which he said it should be done. The centurion was correct. The centurion had the right picture in his mind. It was right. God sent his Son with total authority over all of creation as he himself had created. The working theory that John is using isn't hidden. It isn't a mystery. He defines it very, very clearly in the first chapter of John when he talks about, in the beginning, in the creation event, God created. Well, let me just go back and read. Because it's important to realize the working theory that John uses here, that he's looking at the proof of, comes this way. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. See, that's the working theory. Jesus was in the beginning with God. He was with God in the beginning, and through him all things were made, and without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. In him was life. In him was life. You see, he made his scientific theory very clear. And he goes on down through. We didn't always recognize him. We didn't see it. But that's what was happening right here in the Jesus event. And this is the second of the miraculous signs. Jesus said, your son will live. He'll be healed. And one of the agents of God's army was dispatched to do it just as he had been commanded. Oh. Now, if you have a different theory as to how that could have happened, I'm willing to listen. But unless you have something that has a pretty convincing argument, I'm going to stay with the one I've got. Jesus was the commander-in-chief of an entire army of agents doing God's will on earth, even as it is being done in heaven. He knew how the machine worked because he created it. He knew how the mechanisms were operating. And if something went out of kilter, he knew how to put it back in gear. If something had gotten broken, he knew how to put it back in place. He was willing to get down in the middle of that mess and struggle around down here for 3 years to show us it can be fixed. And I can fix it for you. I know how it's supposed to be. See why I told my story earlier? Scientific method. I got one more for you before I... Number 3. This comes in the 5th chapter of the Gospel of John. It's the third of 7. The third of 7. Now, he's already proved by turning water into wine and healing the official's son But that was in the area of Galilee. That was up in the northern section, 70, 80 miles or so from Jerusalem. Jerusalem's where all the bigwigs are located. Jerusalem's where all the decisions are made. It's where all the government is. It's where all of the Supreme Court is. It's where all the religious seminaries are. It's where all the experts in the law live and talk and work and decide who is telling the truth and who isn't. Okay. 2 experiments that prove the same point are very powerful. 2 that prove the same point are very powerful. This is the third one. Starts in the first verse of chapter 5. Sometime later, Jesus went up to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish festivals. Now there is in Jerusalem, near the sheep gate, a pool, which in Aramaic is called Bethsaida, and which is surrounded by 5 covered colonnades. Here a great number of disabled people used to lie: the blind, the lame, the paralyzed. One who was there had been an invalid for 38 years. An invalid in that time period was someone who was completely helpless, who was unable to move on their own, unable to function on their own, unable to feed themselves. I mean, a person who was an invalid was in constant need of care. And there he sat, there he lay, on the pool right next to the water of Bethsaida. And here's what it says. And they waited for the moving of the waters. From time to time an angel of the Lord would come down and stir up the waters. The first one into the pool after such a disturbance would be cured of whatever disease they had. That's an explanation of why they were at the pool of Bethsaida. It was the pool of healing. We have hospitals named Bethsaida because that's the place of healing. They didn't have hospitals in Jesus' day. They didn't have medical clinics or ERs. They only had a pool in Jerusalem. And one of those agents of God was sent periodically to stir the water in a miraculous sense and give hope and healing to those who were paralyzed or hurting or blind or lame, in terrible pain, that they could quickly enter the pool after that disturbance, and God would work a miracle of healing in their life. Now, it was an amazing place, and it was right outside the wall of Jerusalem, the temple compound. I mean, it was right close to the place where they worshiped Almighty God. It was almost like every once in a while God would say, I need to show my compassion to one of these hurting people. And the water would be stirred, and they would be healed. But here's a man who's been laying there for 38 years. When Jesus saw him lying there and learned that he had been in this condition for a long time, he asked him, "Do you want to get well?" "Sir," the invalid replied, "I have no one to help me get into the pool when the water is stirred, and while I'm trying to get in, someone else goes down ahead of me." Then Jesus said to him, "Get up, pick up your mat, and walk." And he did. It's hard for me to describe the sorrow and suffering I have seen in the lives of people who've been disabled for many, many years. As a teenage boy, my dad would take us down to the nursing home. And in the Ferris nursing home there in Columbia City, Indiana, my aunt would be lying in a bed. She was a very small lady, very tiny frame. She had arthritis very, very severely. She was almost completely blind and nearly totally deaf. And she was curled up into a fetal position with her arms curled in and her legs almost all the way up to her chest. Underneath this blanket, she looked almost like a baby. She was in excruciating pain. And my father and the family would go into that little area. She didn't have a room. It was a bed, sort of like in a hallway. It wasn't like we have nursing homes and hospitals today. And this little shriveled lady could not hear anybody speak except the booming voice that my dad had. The kind of preacher's voice that could punch through whatever kind of noise was going on around. And he would speak with her and talk with her, and she would respond. She was the sweetest lady. There wasn't a bit of rancor or sorrow or self-pity or anything in her. She just lay there, just hands twisted and knurled and toes all curled up underneath the soles of her feet and laying there in a drawn up position. And my heart, isn't there something we can do for these people? She didn't get the healing until she went to be with the Lord. And Ivy. It was a tremendous lesson for those of us. Because when Jesus looked out over the crowd on that day in Jerusalem, and he looked across that whole accumulation of people who were blind, broken, twisted limbs, sick, suffering. If it had been the year 2020, they'd have been on ventilators and 16 different tubes running into them. Machines keeping them alive. And he looked across that group and he said, what is the worst possible situation in this group? And his heart was drawn to this man. 38 years laying with a thin pad, a rug, a carpet over a stone floor for 38 years. I imagine, pretty accurately, he looked pretty much like my aunt. Do you want to get well? Almost seems like a cruel question to ask someone that's hurting that bad and been there that long. But what Jesus was saying is, you don't need an angel to stir water. You don't need to wait here any longer. The God that stirs the water is standing right here in front of you. Be healed. Be completely healed. Untwist all those locked up joints. Unfurl all those arms and legs. Stretch out a body that has not moved for decades. Return all the strength to those nerves and tissues and fibers and muscles. Restore all of the dynamic power. If you've been laying down in a hospital bed once in a while, they'll ask you to sit up once in a while and your head goes, whoa, whoa, because I'm not used to the changes of going from horizontal to vertical. Now he did something even more extraordinary than that. Stand up, then bend over and roll up your rug so that you can leave your space for somebody else that needs it. Put it on your shoulder and walk home. Don't take 5 or 6 steps and see if you can do it. No. Put your rug on your shoulder and head for home. You have been physically 100% restored. What's our working theory? What did John tell us at the beginning? In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and with the Word there was nothing made that was made that He didn't make, and there was absolutely nothing, and His power was life, and health and strength and vitality. Let me think. Have we ever seen anything like that before? Even if a team of people would have pitched him in the pool, they didn't need a pool. The man who made the pool move was standing right there. The man who ordered the pool to move was the author and the creator of the system in which you lived in this body. Pretty incredible, really. To me, it makes me humble. When I get my little anointing oil out here and I go into a sick room and they ask me to pray and anoint a sick person as the scripture tells us to do, I always have the same picture in my head. I always have the same mental image. Here I am, standing with Jesus at the pool, and he said, "Do you want to get well?" Stand up and walk. God has that power. God has that authority. And in this case, everybody in Jerusalem, there wasn't a single soul within 12 hours of that event that didn't know that Jesus had done this thing by the power of God. Immediately the chief priest challenged him. Immediately they tried to find out who in the world did this, because it was on the Sabbath day. And they went through and the entire community, from the temple hierarchy all the way through to the street cleaners in the average day life of the city, all knew the man that everybody in town recognized as being the invalid by the pool. He doesn't have a name. We just have the identity of the guy who is the invalid by the pool. They knew him. They recognized him. They understood who he was, what he'd been through. I gotta stop 1 second though before I finish this story and go on to the next miraculous sign. Because Jesus gives him a warning as well. Please understand, I'm not threatening you. I'm not demanding anything of you. I just want you to be aware. I want you to be aware. Jesus loves unconditional. He showed this man unconditional love. But it's also conditional. Because Jesus found him, the man who'd been an invalid for 38 years, in the temple. Recognized him, followed him maybe, knew where he was. I have to understand now, this man for 38 years hadn't been able to go into the temple and worship. This was an opportunity for him to walk through the front doors of the temple. He hadn't been able to do that for over 38 years. Found him in the temple. And he said to him, "See, you are well again." Isn't that wonderful? Praise the Lord. And then he said, "Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." Jesus had a word of warning for him too. Healing. Wonderful, fantastic, cool. And a warning. Stop sinning. Stop sinning. Surrender your heart, your mind, your soul, your strength to the Lord and serve Him. You have been spending 100% of your life on yourself. Your needs, your pains, your sorrows, your complaints. No one's there to help me in the water, and when it's stirred, somebody else steps in ahead of me. Oh, poor me, I'm all alone. Stop sinning. Stop sinning. Please, please, tell your Lord how sorry you are that you've been sinning. And stop. God's standing right in front of you. Just like He was the man who was laying by the pool. Just as He was standing there in front of the man in the temple courtyards. And just like you. And He's whispering to you. I'm here to help you. But you have to stop sinning. Or something even worse will happen to you. It wasn't a threat. It was a reality that He simply spoke the truth. It wasn't a curse. Any more than I would curse somebody and say, no, you don't believe like I did. No. It was the truth. And Jesus spoke it with gentleness. Stop sinning. Avoid the tragedy that are going to come to people who do not surrender their heart to me. It's a good message for you too. That'll be the end of this one. I'll go back and finish the rest of those miraculous signs, but I wanted you to see the scientific method that is coming closer and closer to locking this truth up in 7 proofs. God bless you.